All right. Thanking God again, this time for his direction and his guidance. Let's call 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the head, reminding us that there is an organizational structure in the church, and specifically the first 16 verses. We're going to talk about God being the head of that structure, as the last half of the chapter or so are going to talk about some problems that the Corinthians are running into because they have lost track of the purpose, a recurrent theme, that God has set for them as the head of not just the church, but all things. But it's going to start out with a famous passage, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Paul's going to start out the 11th chapter seeming to possibly pick up on really the things that he stopped or ended up talking about in the 10th chapter. However, in verse 2, he is going to commend them, reminding them that it is not all about directions and explanations, blase, blase, but he commends them specifically because they have remembered the traditions as he gave them to them. But as he gave, traditions, the traditions to them. You get it, hopefully. But he is going to make some caveats. Beginning in verse 3, there are going to be two caveats. First of all, on the issue of head coverings, which is related to that issue of the guidance or the leadership of the organizational structure of the church itself. And then he is going to have an exception for the way that they have begun to stray in observing the Lord's Supper. But first, his guidance on the head coverings is based upon, as we mentioned, the structure of all things, as verse 4 or halfway through verse 3, it's going to say the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife, that's going to be an important distinction between wife and woman, but the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. The reason why that distinction between a wife and a woman is important is because Paul is going to draw the distinction after he says that a sign of authority on the wife's head, not every woman's head, but on the wife's head, should be some form of head covering. And I'm going to say in addition to her hair, because he is going to use hair as an illustration. As he gets to the end of that section in verse 16, it's going to be the end of an illustration he uses from nature, saying that, especially in that culture, in that time, but not just in that culture, if you get a chance to move around a bit, you'll see that what he's saying is that in nature, it is considered to be an honor for a woman to be able to have and grow long hair in many cultures, even today. And he's going to say, out of that example from nature, the hair is given not only as an honor, but it's given as an example of the way that it's a natural covering given by God. And so if it is generally an honorable covering given by God to all women, he is saying that that is an illustration that it's not too far-fetched to believe that God has also set a head covering as a legitimate thing for a wife in the churches of Christ. And he's going to say if the Corinthians are at odds or want to be contentious about it, it's not a Paul issue. Paul is not the only one out here planting churches and working with churches. He's going to say at the end of that section in verse 16, there's no other tradition in any of the churches. And so if it's an issue, it's a Corinthian issue. It's not a broad issue within the churches. And so just as he has commended them for accepting the traditions as he has given to them, he is helping them to understand that if they have an issue with this tradition as well, it's their issue, not an issue with the churches at large. As he would then go on to say he likewise has some comments for them on the Lord's Supper, beginning in verse 17. He's going to say, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. So he's saying when they come together as a church, as he has talked about before in the first 6 chapters, it is actually bringing to the surface some of the divisions that they might have lingering beneath the surface. And so their assemblies are actually highlighting some of the distinctions or divisions that are already an issue. The issues, as we said, that he's dealt with in the first 6 chapters, maybe even. But he's going to go on to say it's not all bad, because in those divisions, there is a surfacing or, let me just read it. In verse 19, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. Thing I want to go back to after we go through the rest of the chapter, because that's going to be important. But before that, in verse 20, he's going to say, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. In contrast, he's going to say the Lord's Supper that he actually got, he's going to describe in verses 23 through 26, as he's going to contrast that to what they are actually doing, and not only making the contrast between what God gave him and what they've begun to stray off into. He's going to say it's the reason why they're having a certain set of troubles that have become a thing in the church at Corinth, as he is then going to say in verses 33 through the end of the chapter that one of the steps toward moving past their current troubles is reestablishing unity even in the details of things like the Lord's Supper. And among the things that I noticed from this chapter, or at least that stood out to me this time going through chapter 11, I think foremost go back to that section running from verse 17 through 22, specifically in the verse we read before, verse 19, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. And one of the things that seemed to stand out to me began, I guess, in verse 21, where he seems to go through a few things that seem to be, to me, red flags that might help distinguish those who are genuine in that particular situation from those who aren't. And it reminded me going back to the divisions that he addressed in the Roman church, where at the end of chapter 1, he gives a whole laundry list of terms that seem to develop that concept of unrighteousness, going back to our schoolyard days, that in a lot of ways linked to the way that Jesus himself summarized the law in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, golden rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated. If you look at the end of Romans chapter 1, that list of do nots seems to extend from the fundamental core value of putting myself above the interest and the needs of others. Likewise, the manifestations of division here in the Lord's Supper in the church at Corinth seem to fundamentally link to that whole concept or habit of putting my needs above the needs of others. And he is saying until you get that straight, you're going to continue to have verse 27 through 32 problems. But just as there is an upside to the exposed divisions in the Lord's Supper, that's helping you to see that there is a way that even though it might require some repentance and some change, that if you leave those ways behind, he's saying there's some red flags for things you need to stop doing in your Lord's Supper so that you can more effectively come together. Likewise, he's saying there's a purpose for the consequences that God is allowing them to suffer, understanding that it can likewise be hard to acknowledge times when the things that I'm going through, especially I'm going through difficult times right now, the things that I'm going through might actually come from God. And so there are times when it's important to pray, because the relief comes from sometimes finding out, okay, maybe this wasn't something that you actually did, but in times when it actually is, it gives me a chance to change. And so with that, likewise, the church at Corinth is being given the bright side that even if they are going through difficult times, and those difficult times are directly the result of discipline that's coming from God, the upside is his discipline keeps them away from the condemnation that is coming to the world. But there's an even better outcome, and that is in verse 31, where he says you can avoid the discipline of the Lord altogether if you judge yourselves truly. And as hard as it can be to admit that some of the things I'm going through might be related to some things that I need to change, those are the fundamentals of growing in maturity in my relationship with God. And so as I sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that God willing, you can give us the strength to judge ourselves truly so that we can avoid the unnecessary struggle that can sometimes come on top of the necessary struggle that life brings.